Okay, let's talk about the endocrine system. It's one of the two systems in the body that helps control the body. And of course, the other system that controls the body is the nervous system. Now, why do we need two systems to control the body? Because they actually go about it in different ways and they complement each other in how they do this. The nervous system being the system that gives us our consciousness, but also does a lot of things through the autonomic nervous system. In other words, things that we don't necessarily have to think about for it to happen. But the thing about the nervous system is it's usually using neurotransmitters to do very fast events, but the events don't last a long time in themselves. Now, the endocrine system also uses chemicals, but instead of using neurotransmitters, they're using chemical messengers called hormones. Hormones, instead of doing very quick events, they actually cause long-term events to occur, whether that means they're released on a 24-hour period in circadian rhythms, or whether they're released only in certain times in our body when we reach certain mileposts or stages in our life. Okay, another thing is sometimes the same chemical can be both a neurotransmitter or a hormone. It's according to where it's released, and anything that is released into the blood, whether it could also be a neurotransmitter or not, if it's released into the blood, then it is definitely a hormone. Now again, when we say it causes longer term changes in our body, if you think about when we look at somebody, we can kind of tell at what stage of life that they are in. Are they an infant? Are they a toddler? Are they a teenager? Are they, midlife, or are they elderly? So reason why we can tell where they're at in their life is because of the hormones that were released at certain times in their life that basically triggered certain changes. Now, as far as the anatomy of the endocrine system is concerned, it's kind of a unique system because there's no truly just endocrine organs. There are organs that contain endocrine tissues, and there are glands, because remember, our epithelial tissue had both endocrine and exocrine glands in it. So when we look at our list here, our structure list, so to speak, then we're looking at either an organ with a specific part. The brain has a part called the hypothalamus, or we're looking at a specific gland like the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal glands, and so forth. So notice the heart's an organ, and it has several functions. It has a function much more primary than looking at what's going on in the endocrine sense. Same thing with the kidney. The kidney is primarily there to filtrate our blood and get rid of the waste materials, help balance our pH. But it does have the secondary, very important characteristic of being able to secrete this very important hormone, erythropoietin, which is, of course, that hormone necessary for red blood cells to develop. So this list is showing us the anatomical structure and the hormones that are released from these different anatomical structures. So, for instance, just to look at something fairly straightforward, most of you are familiar with the hormone insulin. We know that people who are diabetics often have to take insulin. So insulin is released from a specific part of the pancreas, not the Acini cells, but the pancreatic islets, the kind of circular order of cells that we find inside the pancreas. And of course, they actually have even a further division of cells in them we'll mention a little bit later, but they're going to secrete both the hormone insulin and the hormone glucagon. Okay, but let's go ahead and start up here and kind of briefly work our way around, because we'll be talking about some of these in more detail later in the program. But let me go ahead and tell you, you do need to know where is the hypothalamus and what does it secrete? Where's the pituitary gland and what does it secrete? Where's the thyroid gland and what does it secrete? So I am going to expect you to learn those. Okay, first of all, hypothalamus, of course, is that very important homeostatic area of the brain below the thalamus region here. And what it's doing, it's taking a lot of sampling, especially of tissue fluids, and then determining whether it needs to do something about that. So as far as from the endocrine standpoint, it actually produces two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, which has to do with water, and oxytocin, which has to do with a lot of things, including, even though in this case it wouldn't necessarily be used for this, but it's also what creates bonding. It's that chemical that's released when a mother is nursing a child, or your dog sees you and is really happy. Anyway, a lot of interesting stuff about that. So the hypothalamus produces the antidiuretic hormone oxytocin and something called regulatory hormones. Extremely important. We're going to talk quite a bit about those in a few minutes. Okay, now notice though, near the hypothalamus, actually hanging off of the hypothalamus by the stalk called the infundibulum, we have the pituitary gland, and notice that it's divided up into two places, anterior and posterior lobe, which we're going to be talking about. But notice that we've got this adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone, all being produced in the anterior lobe. Now notice here, the posterior lobe, it says release of oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. But didn't we just mention ADH and oxytocin up here? So what's going on? Well, it's actually made here, but it's released into the bloodstream here. So it actually has to travel from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum and be released into the bloodstream in the posterior lobe. Whereas these hormones are actually made and released in the anterior or the front lobe of the pituitary gland, but they're only released once these regulatory hormones tell them to be released, which we'll mention again. Okay, thyroid gland, sits right below your larynx region, and we have a hormone called T3 and T4, which both have iodine in them. Triiodothyronine has 3 iodines, thyroxine has 4, and we'll talk a little bit more about them, but they're basically used for your metabolism, how you're using your energy. And then there's calcitonin, and it has to do with calcium regulation, along with our parathyroid hormones having to do with calcium regulation too, and we'll mention that a little bit later. Okay, our thymus has to do with our development of our T cells, and we've talked quite a bit about that in our lymphatic and immunity information. Okay, our adrenal glands, most of us probably know that adrenaline is released from there, and adrenaline is basically what we call epinephrine and norepinephrine, but and the adrenal glands are divided up into different areas, an outer area called a cortex and an inner area called a medulla. But we have some other really important hormones that are developed there. We're going to talk about those. Okay, the pineal gland or pineal gland, melatonin, we mentioned that last semester when we talked about the brain, but we'll talk a little bit more about it. Okay, our parathyroid glands, which are on the back of the thyroid glands, also help us in dealing with our calcium levels. Okay, the heart has a couple different things that are released. We're not going to really talk too much about them, but they are hormones that are released in basically helping the heart with its contractility. Okay, the kidney again has both erythropoietin and calcitriol, which also deals with calcium, but in a different way. Okay, adipose tissue, and then in our digestive tract, there are several hormones released from there. So when we get to the digestive system in the lecture, I'm going to be talking more about these specific hormones. Okay, pancreatic islets, as we mentioned earlier, coming from our pancreas. And of course, these are two hormones that basically help us with dealing with glucose, and we'll talk about that. Okay, then our gonads, which in males are going to be testes. They're going to produce androgens, and especially the main androgen is called testosterone. And in females, the ovaries are going to produce the female hormones of estrogens, progestins, and inhibin. Well, let's start out talking about the organ that releases the most hormones, and that's going to be our pituitary gland. And here is our sella turcica, our Turkish saddle that we talked about quite a bit last semester. And then here's the hypothalamus. So here's the stalk connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and it's called the infundibulum. Now notice we actually have what's called an anterior lobe, also referred to as an adenohypophysis, a posterior lobe, also referred to as a neurohypophysis. And notice even in the picture, they look different from each other. And in reality, in their embryonic formation, they develop separately and then kind of fuse together. The posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, being basically being developed from neural tissue, and then the anterior lobe, the adenohypophysis, being mostly epithelial tissue, then they fuse. Here's a picture with a little bit more detail. Again, there's our hypothalamus. Here's our anterior pituitary. You can see the endocrine cells. Here you can see the posterior pituitary, and you can literally see neurons that are involved, and you can see how neurons that actually start up here, the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei, you can see basically how their axons extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary. Because as we mentioned earlier, there's actually 2 hormones made here and then secreted down here into this blood vessel in the posterior. And that, of course, is going to be antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, also called vasopressin. And the other one is oxytocin. Now, notice here we had several different hormones, the most in the body, being released from here, but this area has a portal system, a blood vessel system, that actually brings regulatory hormones, which are made from these neurons. Notice these neurons don't synapse all the way down into the anterior pituitary, but they synapse into this portal blood system. There's the end of the axon there, the end of the axon there, because the regulatory hormones are made here. Then they go through the blood, like hormones do. They go down here and they trigger these cells to further make the hormones that they make, and then those hormones are put into the blood to go to the body where they need to go. Now again, we got our hypothalamus, we have our anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Again, notice how we have these neurons going down here and then releasing their 2 products down into the posterior pituitary, antidiuretic hormone, which helps in water conservation in the body by building water channels in the cells of the distal convoluted tubules and in the collecting ducts. We also have oxytocin, which does a couple jobs that this mentioned here, but it does much more. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but sometimes it's even called the love hormone. And it's actually that hormone released when you get those feelings of attraction or care or love. And it's a bonding hormone. So animals that actually bond usually release oxytocin, and then they usually release oxytocin in the presence of the one they bond with. And that includes mothers with babies, or husband and wife, or whatever. The oxytocin is the chemical of bonding. All right, now, but notice the anterior pituitary actually releases the most hormones, okay? It releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone, then the luteinizing hormone, and both the follicle stimulating and the luteinizing hormone are called gonadotropins, and then finally melanocyte stimulating hormones. All right, now, but when do they release this? Well, they will only release these when they are told to release it by the regulatory hormones. Remember, I told you that the regulatory hormones were made in the hypothalamus, and then they synapsed on the blood vessel running to here. So these all have to have a signal of when to be released. They don't just release randomly. Okay, then these hormones go somewhere and trigger them to release hormones in the most cases. So notice adrenocorticotropic goes to the cortex of the adrenal gland, causing it to actually release the glucocorticoids, which is cortisol and corticosterone. Now, cortisol is that thing that's actually called, that's actually has a nickname called the stress hormone. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. So that's the stress hormone is actually released from this. But what it really does, it's actually given to us to help us make it through physically damaging emergencies. It actually is there to help us heal faster. But most of the time we're not in physically demanding emergencies. We're mostly in mentally demanding emergencies. Therefore, what is supposed to help us heal will sometimes break down our immune system.